Hello, and thank you for joining us. We are gathered together, but remotely, and I am thrilled to be hosting this review summary session of the Nantucket Bird Count of this year, and the Nantucket Christmas Bird Count, I should say. So my name is Yvonne Valancourt, and I'm the director of the Nantucket Field Station. We're an entity of UMass Boston, and we run classes. We support a lot of researchers from a variety of institutions, both academic and agencies, and people who do research on Nantucket who aren't necessarily from UMass can use our facilities. We sit on 100 acres, actually more than that, owned by the Nantucket Conservation Foundation. And normally, after the Nantucket Christmas Bird Count, the tradition has been for the participants and the team leaders of the sections covered by our bird count to gather at the Nantucket Field Station in our conference room. And it's a lovely tradition. And then we embark on this tally night where we go through 255 or so species of birds. And one by one, we ask the team captains, have you seen this bird? And they answer with the number they saw, whether it's 0 or more. And so for those of you who haven't ever participated in this, it's really a fun event. But as you could imagine, it could take some time, and in particular when stories pop up or contentious questions arise. And it's a great event, and many of us are very sad that we're not doing that, and we weren't able to do that this year. So we thought this would be a great way to at least summarize the results and the highlights that we all who were able to get together to actually go through that list have to provide to everyone. So we're not going species by species through 255 birds tonight. We're actually going to summarize what we did already. And so it is my pleasure to start this off this evening, and I'd like to just go over a few things first about how this will function. I'm happy to be hosting this, but again, it is Edie Ray who is the magnanimous organizer, and Libby Buck, who will be joining me as the main speakers here. I'm your MC, but I do have a little bit to talk about. And then they will be guiding you through the highlights of our count results. So for the participants that are joining us, you'll be able to participate when we get to the question and answer period. If you have questions or comments or stories that you would like to share, please use the chat box function so that you can note them. We're not going to pause to answer questions or take comments until we get to that period of this event. I would like to start by saying we are in the 121st year of Audubon's Christmas Bird Count, and on Nantucket, we're actually in our 65th year of having a Christmas Bird Count. And when I went to the website to kind of look up a few things, it's great because you can see the data coming in, and at this morning, the last time I looked, you could actually see that there were 688 contributing counts that had uploaded their data. So it may be larger than that now, but it's quite interesting to see just how many different counts are contributing to this. Additionally, at that point in time this morning, 13,389,115 birds had been counted. And I just find that really exciting that we are part of that contribution. So I said I went to the Audubon website. I went there with the hopes of finding some historical information, and lo and behold, did I. It is a wonderful resource for so many reasons, but what I was thrilled to find was the very first summary of the first Nantucket Christmas Bird Count. And for me, it was really exciting. And here it is. If you wanted to read it and have it yourself, you could find it on Audubon's website. They have a content area, or you could just Google summary Christmas bird counts, and you can see them from anywhere in any year going back to 1900. And I just thought that was really interesting. The first Christmas bird count on Nantucket was in 1955. There were 4 people that made up one party, and those 4 people were naturally Edith Folger Andrews and Clint Andrews, Ken Blackshaw, or as it says down here, Kenny Blackshaw, and John B. Dennis, who was the compiler. And these 4 people set out on Nantucket for our first Christmas bird count, or at least the first one where the data was uploaded. Perhaps Ken can tell us if this was indeed the first one or the second, but this was the first one where data was uploaded to Audubon. It was a cold day. I thought it was just really interesting to be able to read the details of it. These 4 people were able to count 56 species. 203,269 individual birds were counted by 4 people in that period of time. It was cold, it was in the 20s. 95% of the inland ponds were frozen. And of course you can see the list of birds, and I'm not going to go through the whole write-up, but I just thought that was really interesting. And before plowing forward, it was kind of cool to look all the way back. I just thought this was really a great resource, and very interesting to see what 4 people could do over the same space that we are covering. And I have to pause and also acknowledge that you can't be on Nantucket and not realize the incredible legacy that Edith Folger Andrews has left us. Myself, I'm a fledgling birder, and so for me to have the people that she has educated and brought by, and also the actual resources, the reference books that she wrote together with Ken Blackshaw, and the additional references from people like Ken and others like Edie Ray here, people that Edith Andrews spent lots of time with, and also her daughter, Naturally Ginger, who writes for our column for the Inky Mirror, the local paper. So I just wanted to point that out. And as a person who really just started getting into birding more seriously, the only good part about having this remote year for me, despite missing the tally night up here at the field station, I could actually put more time into birding on the actual count day, which I was very happy to do. And as a first-time birder, having local references, I mean, eBird is great because you can see what people are seeing in your area, but to actually read some accounts and to see some of the different habitats that are known around the island is extremely helpful. And for people who are tuning in that are new to this, you should see if your region, if you're not part of our Nantucket circle, has some similar local references, because they are really very good to have in your list of birding books. Anyway, moving right along. The Nantucket Christmas Bird Count results of this year couldn't have happened without our participants, and we had 8 sections in Nantucket that we were covering, and each section has a captain. And though we had to abide by these COVID rules where we couldn't congregate, we were able to assemble 40 or so people that were field watchers, as well as around 30 feeder watchers, which was really great. We had beautiful weather, low winds, good visibility. It was warm, not too cold at night or in the early morning, but the beautiful weather did bring out a lot of people and their dogs. So that created some challenges as we tried to see as many birds as we could. The total number of bird species that were counted was 129, and the total birds counted were 41,134. And I started to get a lot of questions the night of the tally. So after we assembled this information with the captains of each section one night on Zoom, as we are tonight, and tallied. And as we did that, and afterward, I started to wonder, well, does every section have very similar birds or not? And I graphically wanted to see that. So on the map of Nantucket, you can see our 8 sections, and what we get from the tally night that you don't get from the Audubon summary information is that question I had. So we have at each section, you can see in white, I added the species number and the individuals counted. And then the pie next to it, the pie chart, represents those species, and the size of each piece of pie is the number of species, or the number of birds counted within each species. So also the size of the pie represents how many total birds are counted. So if you look at Great Point, out of the 129 species that were counted, 54 of them were counted or seen at Great Point. And yet, you know, over 12,000 individual birds were counted. And when you ask yourself, well, which ones were really abundant and which ones were rare, how does that look? You can see that there were an awful lot of what happens to be, this green is common eider. So of this pie, there were a lot of those. And when you look across all of the 8 sections, you can see that none of them have 129 species. In fact, none of them have 100 of the 129 species. They vary. Out here, right next to Great Point, you have 88 in Quidnat, so it was a little more diverse. And that kind of makes sense. I think the terrain here is very similar, whereas there's probably more habitat variety here. But I guess our captains and participants could let us know. But as you look across, you can see they're really variable. And that was interesting to me. And I just wanted to point that out because for those of you that are new to this or thinking of being involved more, it really matters that we count everything as much area as we can get to, because those areas are really different. When I looked at this, I asked myself within the numbers if you could see the percentage of species that existed in just one region or 2 regions, and that came out to be around 36 for our list, if I did that right, because I did it kind of quick. But that's really a good point to keep in mind, that it does matter that we get out and we cover the whole area. And to our participants, I know you know this, but I wanted to share that with people who are new, because we have some new people that joined in. And now I would like to hand the reins over to the real ringleaders here, Edie Ray and Libby Buck. And they're going to go over the highlights of the count.
Hi there, Edie Ray here. Just wanted to go over some of the highlights of our Christmas bird count this year. Sometimes the highlights aren't the most ducks or the most birds that you see or the most unusual ones. It's just sort of like, you know, relative to other years. Was it a good year for this type of bird or a bad year for this type of bird? Why didn't we see more or whatever? So we're going to start off with common eider, which is a beautiful sea duck. That's a male that's pictured there right now. These birds are actually pretty interesting for those of you who might not know that eider down comes from eider ducks. So if you're wearing a coat or a jacket and you have a down filling, it could be from an eider duck. They nest so far north that they actually line the females line the nest with some of their breast feathers, which they pull out, and they're wonderful insulation. They also breed in Massachusetts, which is kind of cool. They eat things like mussels and crabs and other mollusks. So they dive down into the water and grab these things up and chomp them down. There have been some mass mortality issues, 5 times at least since 2006. They had a virus, and they also had infections of like a worm that came from some of the food that they were eating. So it was pretty horrifying in some years to see just dozens and dozens of dead eiders washed up on the beach. That's kind of gross, but had to throw that in there. The CBC numbers on Nantucket fluctuate from year to year. A lot of times it's, whether or not we could actually see them. Sometimes it's so foggy and these ducks are out in the ocean, you can't see them. But this year we had a pretty good showing of 13,933. I know in other years, in 1956, the very first bird count, there were about 2,000 of them seen. And if you want to go see them yourself, a good place to look is off the west end, off of Low Beach. And also you can see them more closely in the harbor, and then you can really appreciate just how beautiful they are. Tuckernuck had an amazing count of these birds this year. They had 250,119 birds. These were mostly, I think, off the west end of the island. And in the wintertime, these ducks are found, like most things, where the food is. So they had a tremendous count. Long-tailed ducks are also handsome sea ducks. We had quite a few this year. These birds, again, nest way up in the north. They eat things like marine crustaceans and aquatic insects. They eat mussels and small fish and all sorts of things like that. And if you Google them, you can actually watch them diving down to great depths, sometimes to 200 feet, to get this their food. And they actually look like they're flying underwater. It's pretty amazing. You should definitely try Googling that. In 2005, we had a staggering count of long-tailed ducks on the Christmas bird count. There were 342,095 were counted. This is because years ago, these ducks would sleep in Nantucket Sound, get up sometimes before dawn, overfly the west end of the island, and then go feed out in the open ocean over areas where their food was. And then in the evening, they would reverse course, fly back over the west end of the island to sleep in the Sound again. In the Birds of Massachusetts by Dick Veet and Wayne Peterson, it's called, this overflight twice a day of Nantucket is called one of the most spectacular ornithological phenomenons that occurs in Massachusetts. And indeed it was. Unfortunately, these numbers are way down now of old squaw, or long-tailed ducks as they're now called. And in 2020, we had only 1,910 of these birds. In 1956, there were 166 that were seen. So the question is, of course, where are they? The answer is, I certainly don't know. I think it's not felt that the numbers have taken a large nosedive. It's just that they go where the food is, and the food is not here right now. Want to talk next about red-throated loons. Red-throated loons actually don't much look like that in the winter. They don't even have a red throat. So if you're looking for a loon with a red throat this time of year, you're not going to find one off Nantucket waters. They're more sort of gray above and a little bit lighter below. One of the things that will help you identify them is they hold their nose slightly upward, sort of a snooty look to them. They breed, again, up in the high Arctic, way up north. They eat fish, aquatic insects, mollusks, squid, And what's pretty cool is sometimes you'll look out and you'll see this bird swimming around and it looks like it has no head. That's liable to be a red-throated loon because they actually stick their head underwater and look for prey as they swim along. They like to winter in shallow marine waters, which is pretty cool. And that's why we get to see them here on Nantucket, close to shore, which is convenient if you're trying to count them. In 2020, on our CBC, we had 1,305. There was a big flight off Low Beach that Shay and the Low Beach crowd got to witness. In 2019, the flight was even bigger, and there were 4,295 of these guys counted. Pretty amazing. And in 1956, there were none that were seen. Where to go to find these guys? Off Low Beach is a great spot to start, and pretty much anywhere from Nantucket, if you're looking at the ocean, if you hang out long enough, you're liable to see one. I want to talk a little bit about lesser black-backed gulls. These are sort of herring gull-sized birds. Their mantle or their back is gray and sort of halfway grayish between a herring gull's gray back and a great black-backed gull's back. One thing that they do have that's rather distinctive when they're adult birds is pretty bright colored yellow legs. So that's kind of helpful if you're trying to find some. These birds are from across the pond. They breed across Europe. They're expanding their wintering and breeding ranges. But I think what's pretty interesting is they have not been found to breed in the United States as yet. They have hybridized, that is bred, a herring gull has bred with a lesser black-backed gull and produced chicks. And some of those have actually been resighted, which is cool, but we're all kind of waiting to find out where there's a true lesser black-backed gull pair breeding in the United States. They were first recorded on the Nantucket Christmas Bird Count in 1979. And in 2020, we had 113 of these guys. In 1956, they just weren't around yet. They hadn't come across from Europe, so there were none. If you want to see them, I would suggest off the eastern shore. Low Beach, again, is a great spot to see these guys. Another bird that was interesting, and I know a lot of people always have questions about, are double-crested cormorants. These are dark birds. You often see them standing on the shore or on docks and jetties holding their wings out to dry. This is because they have less oil in their wings than other birds that hang out in the ocean. They were first found breeding on Nantucket at the end of the East Jetty in the early 2000s, which is pretty cool. And they first bred on the beach on Nantucket in 2013 out on Cove 2. They eat fish and crustaceans. They're very strong underwater swimmers. And it's quite amazing to watch them go down and then come up with something yummy. There have been in the past controls on these birds, on their populations. In some areas, it's felt in the past and almost currently that they're eating too many fish. So there have been projects to control their numbers. They were first recorded on the Nantucket Christmas Bird Count in 1977. And in 2020, we had 45 of these guys. And interestingly enough, on Tuckernuck, none were found this year. Where to go to find them? East Jetty and the harbor, and also My Comet Pond's a good spot. Common Gallinule is the next bird I want to talk about. One of my personal favorites, actually. They're kind of a long-legged chicken kind of bird. Looks a little bit like a coot or a duck. They're pretty snappy looking in breeding plumage. They have this amazing kind of orangey red bill. And they do breed in Massachusetts, but they're listed as a species of special concern because there's just not many of them here. They eat things like vegetation, seeds, snails, insects, grasses, etc. And as a matter of fact, today I was watching two of them on my back lawn eating grass. So they definitely eat grass. They were first seen on the Nantucket Christmas Bird Count. One of them was seen in 1961, and the numbers have always been either none. The highest we've ever had on a bird count were 3. This year, in 2020, we did have 2 of them. And the best place right now to see them, other than my lawn, is in Myacomet Pond. And then purple sandpipers. Now, most of us know that most shorebirds hightail it out of here when it gets cold. They head south, they migrate south. Interestingly enough, purple sandpipers come to us from the north, and they're one of the most northern overwintering sandpiper type birds. They breed way north in the Canadian Arctic, Hudson Bay, a whole bunch of other places. And what's interesting I found was when I looked it up, is that the females leave the nest about when the eggs start to hatch, and they leave the males to raise the young. I thought that was rather interesting. They winter along rocky coasts, pretty much Newfoundland to Virginia, and they happen to hang out on the jetties here on Nantucket. They eat things like aquatic invertebrates, flies, spiders, small crabs, and things like that. They were first seen on the Nantucket Christmas Bird Count in 1933. And this year, in 2020, we had 40. And Tuckernuck, they don't have a lot of rocks over there that form jetties and things like that. So unfortunately, they're really unusual to find. And there were indeed 0 this year. Actually, if you go down to the jetties, I was there yesterday and got to see some there. So that's where I would advise you to head in case you wanted to see some. So I think we're going to turn it over to Libby and let her hit some of the highlights of some other birds from the Christmas Bird Count, starting with turkey vultures.
Thank you, Edie. Yeah. So I'm going to start with the turkey vultures, and I know people around the island have been seeing more and more of these as it goes on. And ironically enough, the turkey vulture first time was seen on the Christmas bird count in 2000 with only 2 individuals. The turkey vultures are one of the species that have moved, they keep moving north, like they keep expanding their range because as the climate gets warmer, they just keep moving up further and further. You've probably seen many around the island and possibly have seen their roosts, especially in the middle moors. This year, we had a total of 92 on the count, so their population continues to grow, whereas last year we had about 62. We don't have any black vultures, too, just to throw that out there to the crowd. We've only have the turkey vulture, so if you do see a black vulture, that's pretty important, and we need to know about that. So with the northern harriers, they are an endangered species, but they do quite well on Nantucket. They are ground nesting hawks, and they depend on like open fields and shrubby areas for their habitat. And they first showed up on the first Christmas bird count, and you can see it as a marsh hawk, actually, when you go back in time, especially with that little excerpt that Yvonne posted earlier. And this year we had a total of 33. So yes, they are endangered, but they do quite well on Nantucket. If you ever want to see one, they typically, you can find them out at the smooth hummocks area, but especially out at Coatue and out at the head of the plains. The red-tailed hawks, people, I don't know about you, but people keep talking about the red-tailed hawks, especially this year, and they've been doing quite well. This year we had about 61 on our count, and they keep maintaining their population because that was about the same as last year. Sometimes people get kind of thrown off with the red-tailed hawks because they won't have their red tail, but that's just because they're a juvenile hawk. But we did pretty good this year, so they're still going well. So the Merlin and Kestrels. Merlins, they first showed up on the Christmas bird count in 1969 with 2 individuals and stayed only consistent, having about 1 or 2 up until 1985. Now the population continues to grow because based on climate again, they have found that the young keep expanding their range to try to find new wintering locations, but they have found that our climate with Nantucket would be fine for nesting as well. But it kind of seems to counteract with the kestrels. So the kestrels used to be abundant here on Nantucket, and they were on the first Christmas bird count, and they were also called the sparrowhawk at the time. But they had a high in 1980 of 22 pairs, and they kind of just have a downward trend since 1996. The American kestrels, there's different ideas of like why their population is declining, but they are cavity nesters. So they're constantly looking for a cavity to nest in. They're not gonna build their own nest. They're gonna try to hollow out in a tree or something like that. So people now have made more of a conscious effort of building these like kestrel boxes to help with their population to come up from decline. But unfortunately for Nantucket, well, I guess it's not that unfortunate because it did show up on our Christmas bird count. We had 2, but there used to be crazy numbers for kestrels. In regards to the barn owls, as many of you know, the barn owls, they have a huge conservation effort with the Mariah Mitchell Association. If you haven't heard of it, please go check it out. It's really awesome. A lot of people have these barn owl boxes, and you can be a part of the program, and they come out and check them all throughout the season. But this year we had 14 on the count versus 4 on last year's Christmas bird count. And that probably has to do that we have a more mild winter this year. But it was amazing because we had all these more feeder watchers, and they also had these like barn owl boxes. So they're paying attention, whereas a lot of people leave for the island and they aren't here paying attention. So a lot more was on the count. And then for the snowy owls, everybody's favorite is the snowy owl. And this year we only had 1 on the count. Not every year we can have an eruption year like we did in the winter of 2014. The only one snowy owl was seen out on Kotu on the count day. And the next day it was actually seen out on Smith's Point. It could be possibly a different individual. And but the eruption year, you can't bank on it every year. And Edie will now tell you about like the other species that we have had an eruption year this year.
So eruptive years happen because of food sources. So birds that would normally spend much more time in north of where we are, when they run out of food or when the food source gets low, they start expanding and moving south and looking for food. Some of the birds that have been doing that are so-called winter finches, birds such as red crossbills, evening grosbeaks, pine siskins, redpolls, purple finches, and things like that. And these eruptions are cyclic. So you have really good years, there's lots of seeds, lots of cones, lots of stuff for them to eat. And then for whatever reason, drought or other reasons, the seed crop or cone crop fails. These birds are hungry and they start showing up south of where they would normally be wintering. And one of the birds that this happened to this year is our red crossbills. Red crossbills are really cool birds. You can't really see unless you really zoom in on that bill, but they have this crazy looking bill that's literally like crossed scissors. And this bill is made for opening cones and other food sources. There's approximately, thought right now anyway, 11 different subspecies or call types of these birds. And they're differentiated by experts by the bill shape, the heaviness of the bill, the markings of the bird, as well as their calls, the sounds that they make. So I know that a number of people have seen them here on Nantucket. I have to say I have not yet caught up with one, but it is my mission to do so. I'm going to be on the lookout. So they breed in North America, Southern Alaska, Newfoundland, and other points north. And occasionally, I'm told, in New York, which I thought was interesting. Different bill types will feed on different types of cones. So it's really interesting if you look in a bird book to see which types of these birds are where and what their food sources are. It's quite interesting to check it out. In 2020, as you can see, we had 123 of these birds. On Tuckernuck, there weren't any this year. But in 1956, there were 7 on the very first bird count. So I thought that was quite interesting. If you want to find some, which I certainly do, you need to look in pine groves. They've been seen in pine places out in Sconset, Nantucket, and I think most recently, there was a nice flock of them at Tuppence Links. So I think I'm going to head there tomorrow. Red-breasted nuthatches are another bird that is an eruptive species. And they breed way up in central Manitoba, northern Michigan, all over the place. And also, surprisingly, I thought, in New Jersey, North Carolina, and also in Mass, because their ranges, like Libby was talking about earlier, some birds' ranges are expanding. It also, when I was looking things up, it also said that in eruptive years, like we are experiencing now, some birds that move south tend to stay there and breed there. So we're going to be looking on Nantucket for red-breasted nuthatches breeding, maybe like in the Lover's Lane State Forest this year. They eat things like insects and seeds. They love suet. They're certainly doing a number on my suet that I have at my feeding station. And they are cavity nesters. On Tuckernuck this year, they had 3. And in 1956, they had not yet expanded their range, I think, and there were actually 0. Just to give an idea of sort of the eruptive nature of the birds, you see how many we had in this year. In 2019, there were 18. So there you go. Next, I want to talk about yellow rumped warblers. Birders often call them butterbutts. Previously, they were called myrtle warblers. They are sweet little warblers, and they have this bright yellow patch on their rump. In the winter, they don't look as bright and colorful as that picture depicts them. They look sort of like a funny little brown sparrow with a yellow butt. And they tend to be in flocks, and you'll see them around Nantucket. They mostly eat sort of bugs and other insects in the summer, but they have this amazing ability to switch their diet from pretty much bits of protein in the summer to eating things like bayberry. Now, most warblers, as we know, head south for the winter because their food source, which is bugs and different kinds of insects, they're not available in the winter. But these birds are able to winter far further north than most warblers are by the fact that they can switch their diet to things like bayberry. These waxy coated berries are actually able to be digested by these yellow rumped warblers. In 2020, as you can see, we had a good showing of them. And in 1956, they actually had 200 on the very first count. And Dick and his crew over on Tuckernuck had 97 individuals this year. Now, it's sort of like Where's Waldo when you look at a flock of birds. You're looking for something that stands out, something that's a little bit different. And in Nantucket in the winter, any bird that has anything, any kind of bright yellow on it is definitely something you want to take a very close look at. And we had one homeowner that was very sharp-eyed on December 27th, who looked at the birds in his yard and saw something that had bright yellow on it and knew that it was not something he'd seen before in his yard. So this bird turned out to be an Audubon's warbler. Now, an Audubon's warbler is basically a yellow rumped warbler that looks a little different, has a different kind of call, and lives on the western part of the United States. So it's really the western version, if you will, of a yellow rumped warbler. Where the ranges overlapped between the yellow rump warbler and Audubon's warbler, these birds do hybridize. That is, they interbreed with one another. They eat things like bugs and insects. They also are able to digest bayberry, juniper, and poison ivy. And so it was really exciting to have one on our count this year. There was also one found and carefully documented in 2018 out in Nantucket. So when you see a flock of something, take a close look, because there could be somebody in there that's just like Waldo that doesn't quite belong. Libby, I'm going to turn it over to you for our next group.
Okay. So I'm going to jump into the Bluebirds because that's another one of everybody's favorite. And we ended up having 6 Bluebirds on the count this year. They were at Squam Farm. And they were actually mobbing a flicker, which was pretty entertaining. So the Bluebirds are also cavity nesters, much like the Kestrels. And they don't tend to stay in nests on Nantucket, which is kind of odd because they do definitely nest on Martha's Vineyard and Cape Cod. But the Bluebirds, kind of like what Edie was talking about with the berry diet, they have to change their diet from almost 80% insects into berries such as winterberries, bittersweet, and cherries. And a bunch of other songbirds like the robins, the yellow rump warblers, and mockingbirds also follow suit with this berry diet. Another highlight was we had a winter wren down at Lily Pond this year. That was quite a sight, and they have a really sweet call if you ever go and hear it. But to kind of roll into the wrens, the Carolina wrens kind of went crazy this year. And they're another species for Nantucket that just have seemed to have exploded over the years. It was only in 1990 there was one seen and on a Christmas bird count, and then it just keeps going up from there. Last year we had about 239, and that was the high was in 2011 of 324. So also this depends on the winter. If there's a cold snap, then that definitely depends on how the individuals will react to it. Another huge highlight was the American robins. We had 1,281. And for those of you that are just getting into birding and looking at their birds out at their bird feeder, I'm going to let you in on a secret, but the American robins are always here throughout the winter in Nantucket. The ones you're seeing aren't necessarily the ones that you'll see in the spring. They're probably migrants. And that's why you see an influx more in the spring because they're returning, trying to find new nesting areas and everything. And then another huge thing that keeps, I don't know, just being prominent of the red belly woodpeckers. We seem to be just having a lot more showing up on the island. And a lot of people get the red belly woodpeckers confused with the red-headed woodpeckers because yes, the red belly woodpeckers do have a red head, but they also have a red belly. It's really hard to see the red belly because for the most part, they're hanging onto a tree. And so this year we had 29, whereas last year we had 26, but the high keeps continuing to keep going. And then a really surprising thing was the ravens, and the ravens are really cool. We only had one that showed up last year on the count, and that was the first time that it made it onto a Christmas bird count. They're kind of hard to distinguish between like an American crow. If you don't know what you're looking for, they have a much larger tail, but also their call is different. They kind of have like a croaking call, and they have like a feathers like right underneath their chin. So this year in the summer, and Skylar Cardell, it was basically the one that found it, but it was the first recording of a nesting pair on the Sconset Water Tower, and they were successful at fledging chicks. So this year we had 4 on the count versus 1 that we had last year. And much like all the birds that we keep talking about they keep expanding their range northwards. It seems like the ravens are actually doing the opposite and expanding their range southern. So this is another species just to look out for while you're on the island, because I feel like they're just going to keep going. So I think we want to jump into the feeder watcher. So this year we had a huge, and I thank every feeder watcher that joined the Christmas bird count. We can't thank you enough, honestly. We had over 30, and for the most part, we only had, I don't know, under 5 people that would do feeder watchers for us. And without that, we wouldn't have been able to count as many individuals as we could this year, because we just weren't able to get that many people to come to the island because of COVID and other restrictions. And so these are just a couple photos of everybody's feeders across the island and what they saw. And we honestly just can't thank you enough. And then also with our feeder watcher birds, there were certain species that wouldn't have shown up on our ultimate Christmas bird count list. So out in Nantucket, we had the American Woodcocks, and without that, we would have never known that they were on our list this year. Also, I heard there is this ringneck pheasant in Surfside named Phineas that's been showing up quite often. And without him, he was the only ringneck pheasant that we had this year. So I'm glad he showed up. Really helped us with our species count. And then Yvonne actually had 2 evening grosbeaks that showed up at her feeder. So without her keeping an eye on those, we would never have seen them this year. And then I thought this was pretty neat to like just look through the years to see how many of the total species versus the number of individuals. And yes, this year we were kind of down with, well, we're kind of up too, but like we had a struggle with getting volunteers to join us because of COVID, and we thought that was really going to be effective to how many individuals we ended up getting. But if you can compare it to like 2018, yeah, there was 132 species, but we're relatively around the same number of individuals. So it was kind of nice to see over time how it's been going with all of our Christmas bird counts.
Right.
And then again, these are all the photos that were sent in about who actually was the field observers and the field watchers out there. And we realized towards the end that we were all busy just birding, that we never really got that many photos. So that's why there's only so many few. But we can't thank you enough for all your effort, because we would have never gotten that many birds this year. And it's just amazing that this could happen with all of the circumstances of COVID and everything. And we just can't thank you enough, honestly.
Well, I'd like to thank Edie and Libby for putting all of that together, and for everybody who's joining us right now, whether you're watching on YouTube because we are streaming this to YouTube, or whether you're participating. And I also would like to pause for a moment and thank all of the different groups, as well as every single person who counted, whether you're watching at a feeder or you are out in the field or both, and all of the organizations that just let us roam around and do that on their properties. Thank you very much, everybody. And before we close the slideshow and open the floor for some comments and interesting banter, I would like to remind people, if you're part of the Nantucket birding group, birding community, we've established this Nantucket bird count email, and we would like to centralize our communications a little bit, which is how we were able to pull this off. And with many thanks to Libby Buck for creating the Gmail account. So please look for that email and use it. You can send comments, questions to that account, and we will disseminate information from that account as well. You can still email us, but that's we're trying to centralize that communication through that one email. And save the date. Next year, January 2nd is our Nantucket Christmas Bird Count date. So please take the opportunity now to put that on your calendar, and we'll be sending out a reminder from the nantucketbirdcount@gmail.com email as well. And with that, I'm going to end the slideshow. And we've got 17 people on this Zoom session. So rather than have everyone unmute themselves, I'd like you to remain muted unless you have something you want to say, and if you could wave or put something on the chat box. We've had quite a bit of things come in on the chat box and on the chat box on YouTube as well. I know throughout the entire time, Libby and Edie were going over the highlights. Skylar piped in a lot, and I think it would be really interesting to ask Dick Veet to maybe tell us a little bit about Tuckernuck, because he did write some things in the chat box, and I'd rather not read every comment. I think it would be far more interesting to listen to the people who've written them. So Dick, if you want to unmute and tell the larger group listening, whatever you want to actually, but what you wrote about on the chat box and maybe a little bit about Tuckernuck, that would be fantastic.
Tuckernuck was good this year. We had, I think, 100 and, I'm in the wrong ballpark. I think we had 66 species, which is towards the high, that's above average for the, we've run that count almost every year since 1978, and that's maybe the third or fourth highest count. The highlights were, we had 250,000 common eiders that Edie mentioned, about 1,000 razorbills. There was one female Barrow's goldeneye on the count day, and two a couple days afterwards. Skylar or anyone can help me out with that. I mean, there wasn't any really fancy rare bird, but there were a few other interesting things. Something that occurred to me, I think would be it with the COVID question and less observers. I think it'd be very interesting to, I mean, looking at the total number on the Nantucket count last year and this year, I wonder how much of that difference is due to the eiders being somewhere else or something. I mean, if you just took the passerines, say, this year versus last year, and counted number of passerines per observer or something like that, I think that would be very useful to see how much effect the number of observers had on, because looking around at a Christmas count, you can imagine, I mean, if 100,000 eiders fly by, everyone's going to see them. It doesn't matter whether you have one person or 10 people counting them. But for Carolina wrens in the thickets, you would think that it would make a big difference how many, you know, not just how many parties, but how many individual people are counting. So that this would be an interesting opportunity. I did something like this for Tuckernuck once, and I wanted to know, on the Tuckernuck count, we've had up to about 20 people do the count and down to 1. And I was curious to see how the number of people affected the number of land birds. And I went blindly without looking at what year it was and figured it out and found the count with the highest number of songbirds. And it was the year when I did the count alone. And I'm not, I remember it very clearly. It was a nice day, but there were a lot of birds around. But I think it would be particularly interesting to do the same thing for Nantucket and ask, did numbers of, you know, myrtle warblers or something like that depend on the fact that we had relatively few observers? That's all I could think of about the Tuckernuck count, unless anybody else who was there can remember a special bird. Somebody asked about what happened to the old squaws, and I don't know. I think it's almost certainly climate related. If you look at climate cycles from North Atlantic Oscillation or something like that, those old long-tailed ducks showed up in big numbers in the about 1975, and that was a time when the North Atlantic Oscillation Index shifted quite dramatically, and it stayed in a new state from about the mid 70s up until 2007 or something like that, at which point the long-tailed ducks disappeared. They feed or fed mainly on a pelagic amphipod that's the amphipods form schools like krill or schooling fish. There's still, or you could go to Low Beach and see the same amphipods. The Bonaparte's gulls fed on them. Some of the bigger gulls do as well. It could, I mean, they're still there. It could well be that they've declined a lot, and the NOAA ships sample them. So I'll ask my former grad student, Tim White, if he knows if the amphipods are still there. So possibly there's a shift in food supply. But almost exactly the same year, they didn't show up at Nantucket. A group of a few 100,000, 300,000, 400,000 was found in southwest Iceland. You know, these Iceland pelagic birders had never checked this particular area. They could see them from shore, so they don't know if it was something new there then. But it seems like it's quite a coincidence if they weren't at least partly the same birds.
Thanks,
That's
Dick.
pretty fascinating, Dick. I also am looking at the red-throated loon numbers. To your point of maybe people just weren't there to see. Shay mentioned what a wonderful flight she had, but then also said she had to leave to go elsewhere to count birds. So it could be that numbers of those birds are lower than what was actually out there just because of the observer glitch.
But yeah, I mean, that certainly could be. She also mentioned she had a count of like 4,000 red-throated loons last year. I don't remember if that was the Christmas count, or is Shay there?
That was the Trimbles that had that. She wasn't at Low Beach. She was with me in Quidnet.
Yeah, it was like 4,295.
Because I checked that out, and that is certainly the biggest count ever in Massachusetts. And the only remotely similar counts I could find, I think I sent them to Shay, were from the Avalon Sea Watch, which is about just north of Cape May, New Jersey. And they get up to 100,000 in a whole season, but they're standing there every day, all day for the whole season. And they, I mean, I think their maximum count ever for a day is something like 10,000, but 4,000 in Massachusetts is big news.
It's really cool.
Even 1,000 is a lot.
We have a number of comments that are coming off of YouTube. As I had said earlier, the highlights that were reviewed have a steady stream of indications of where you can still see some things. Skylar and Spruce have both piped in, and some of them, the comments have indicated which bird, but not all of them. So I can tell you that now that we don't see which bird they were talking about, it's hard to decipher that. But lesser black-backed gulls are visible at Great Point. Cormorants at Hummock Pond this evening, and at Low Beach. And then I believe Skylar was saying, and you can chat in if I'm wrong, that purple sandpipers, is that what you were indicating we're also seen at Tuckernuck? And I won't try to keep deciphering them, but I do want to thank participants for commenting. A lot of people, Sarah Boys is piping in about their counts out at Linda Loring, and as well as people on the chat on Zoom. We don't want this to go on forever, although it could easily, because it's very interesting. But if we do have a couple of questions. One was for people who are sort of just starting out with the bird feeder watching, and it has been really helpful with this count. Obviously, that's so great. Edie or Libby, or I suppose anyone else on this Zoom, do you have any suggestions for how to best feed the birds, whether it's to draw more diversity, or how should you do that if you are fairly new at this, or not so new, but feeder points?
I'll take that just briefly. I think a variety of feed that you can offer is obviously going to bring in a bigger variety of birds. The local places where you can buy bird seed, you can go in and check it out. There's different kinds of bird feeders. One of the things that I always advise people in the wintertime is to offer water. A heated bird bath does not cost much in your electric bill, and it will provide a myriad of birds coming to drink and bathe. And also, there's wonderful resources online about how to set up bird feeders, you know, what to do. And very, very important is to keep everything very clean. You don't want to be taking a bath in somebody else's bath water, and neither do the birds. So it's really important to have the water in the thing clean, and also to keep your feeders nice and clean, because diseases can be transmitted. Also, just to jump in about where to see birds, Ginger Andrews writes a wonderful column in our local paper in the Enquirer and Mirror every week and talks about local bird sightings, gives great advice as to where to go see things, and talks about the life and times of various birds that she highlights. So that's a great resource. And also eBird is a wonderful resource on Nantucket and elsewhere. You can get online and see where certain birds have been seen specifically on Nantucket. So those are two great resources if you don't have a birder living next door that you could run over and ask.
Thank you for that. Skylar did pipe back in and say he was referring to crossbills on Tuckernuck, and he also mentioned that there was a yellow throat out there. I thought it might be nice to hear quickly from Barbara White, if you're there still, if you want to tell us a little bit about Phineas. You can unmute yourself. Is she still there? Oh, I don't think she's on anymore, but she wrote in that, you know, they've been feeding him. She's not aware of the lifespan, and they've seen him around for about 4 years, and they had lots of babies, but none have seemed to have survived. What is the lifespan of a, is it a ring-necked pheasant?
I, for one, do not know.
Yeah, no, I don't.
Two-thirds of them die in the first year, and then if they make it through that, probably 7-8 years or something like that.
And people should know, if they don't, that pheasants are non-native to Nantucket, and they are stocked here. In other words, they are bred off-island, brought over here and let loose for hunters to hunt. So every fall we have an influx of visiting pheasants, and some make it through the winter and others don't. That is all.
Thank you so much. Well, I think we've kind of covered the questions and the big points that came out. There's been a lot of comments about how this was a nice event to have, and that it's good for those of us on Zoom to see each other. Like I said, normally the tradition is to gather and to share the events of the count, and to actually compile together and we all did miss that greatly, but this has been wonderful to gather people this way and to share the information. It's a little bit of a different format. And thank you so much for joining us and for participation. There has been also comments saying what a great job to get the numbers we got, given the situation we're in with COVID. And, you know, kudos to the bird feeder watchers and also to everyone who participated. So I think unless Libby and Edie or anyone else out there has a really urgent question or comment, I would like to thank everyone who's here tonight and who contributed and who's just tuning in, because it's really a wonderful community to be part of, and I am very grateful for that. So thank you. I've learned a lot. I look forward to birding all year, even though it's very compulsive and I need to do some other things. But I'm speaking to those people tuning in who maybe are also just starting out. Stick with it. It's so much fun, and it's a great community of people. So thank you so much. Edie and Libby, did you have any?
I was just going to mention that if anybody is curious about the real numbers, like going down line by line of all the species, feel free to just email the Nantucket Bird Count at the Gmail account and we can send it right to you. With this, because we have time constraints, we only pulled what we thought was like the really cool highlighted species. So feel free to bug us about that information.
And it is fun to delve into the line by line numbers and see what's going on specifically. We couldn't mention all of them or we would have been here till the next bird count talking about it. So we just tried to pick out a few things that we thought were interesting that might interest you guys. So thanks for tuning in. Thanks to Libby and Yvonne for doing all this. And next year, mark your calendars.
Mm-hmm.
Be there or be square.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, everyone. And we'll see you out there birding.
Good night.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, Dick.
Happy